Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 66th episode of the Exploring Anti-Natalism podcast, a podcast all about the subject of anti-natalism created by anti-natalists. My name is Amanda Oldphan Sukenick, formerly known as Trevor Wolf Films on YouTube, and today I'm speaking with Assistant Professor of Practice, jointly affiliated with the W.A. Frank Honors College and Philosophy Department of the University of Arizona, as well as author of the book The Environmental Impact of Overpopulation, The Ethics of Procreation, Trevor Hedberg. Welcome to the Exploring Anti-Natalism podcast, Mr. Hedberg.
Hi, Amanda. Thanks so much for having me. I didn't realize this thing had been going on for 66 episodes. That's quite impressive. Lot to say about anti-natalism, I guess.
Yeah, the anti-natal world is very, very vast and growing all the time. And there's a lot to talk about for sure. So yeah, I'm really, really thrilled to have you on the show today. So Trevor, I first became aware of you because you and your work are referenced in the fairly new entry on anti-natalism in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy by Mr. Kirk Lougheed, who was a guest recently on Exploring Anti-Natalism as well. And I was really intrigued to learn that there was someone out there finally actively writing on the subject of overpopulation that dared to bring up the subject of anti-natalism within the overpopulation context. I do believe that you may be the first in doing this. And so I just had to investigate further. Trevor, I'm very excited to get into more details with you today regarding your research and your book, The Environmental Impact of Overpopulation, The Ethics of Procreation. But first, I would love to ask you just a few questions that I ask all my guests, some version up to all my guests. So first off, who is Trevor Hedberg?
Okay, that's an interesting start. I suppose you've already given them my official title. I would say I'm a philosopher really interested in applied issues and in how we ought to live in the world, how we ought to, like, what the ideal human life looks like, how morality fits into that equation. I would also say, outside of my professional context, I'm a gamer. I'm a former I'm a former collegiate tennis player. I'm a big fan of sports, especially NBA basketball and professional tennis. And I would say in general, in some sense, I'm just persistent. I have been bouncing around to different, we originally were arranging this podcast and I was halfway across the country in a different position. I'm one of these sort of, academic nomads who I hope has just found a permanent, position somewhere. So, however you want to characterize that, like an academic survivor or nomad or journeyman or whatever, I think that label is appropriate now after kind of 6 years of bouncing around from Tennessee to Florida to Ohio and now into Arizona.
That is quite a journey. I love that, academic nomad. And you've had, once again, congratulations on your new position in Arizona. And that's a great introduction. How did you originally become interested in the subject of overpopulation? And besides this subject, what are your other primary research interests?
Well, back when I started graduate school, I knew I wanted to do something that would be under the broad label of applied philosophy, that was going to be my long-term objective. I didn't want to do philosophy that was just of purely theoretical interest and had no application to real-world affairs. And so I started taking some applied ethics courses. And when I was taking an intergenerational ethics course taught by John Knoll at the University of Tennessee, I observed that all the stuff that was being talked about seemed really important, really interesting, but there was almost no talk about rising global population in the stuff that we read. Now, this was back like fall of 2010, so a while back. And I asked him about it, and he sort of said, like, yeah, there's really not a lot of literature on that. There are some articles scattered around here and there, and I was able to dig up a few of them. But I basically just asked him, like, well, why? It seems quite obvious that the more people you have, for example, emitting carbon dioxide, the worse climate change is going to get. The more people you have eating meat, the more animals you're going to have suffering in factory farms. The more people you have consuming fresh water, the more likely it is you're going to have regional freshwater shortages. And you can just plug in whatever resource, right, you want. It's the same. So I'm like, so how is that not an issue for long-term environmental sustainability? And he said, oh, it's a huge issue. It's just not something that people write about. And then, of course, the question is, well, why? And so I just kind of tabled that for a few years, talked with him some more about it as time went on. And then when it came time to write a dissertation, I was like, well, it doesn't seem like anybody's really taken up the mantle for that, or at least if they are, I'm not seeing any kind of major visibility of this in the literature. So that was what I decided to write my doctoral dissertation on. Now, as it happens, the year I was getting close to defending, Sarah Connolly comes out with a book called One Child, Do We Have a Right to Have More? And that still, I think, is like kind of the first solo authored monograph that came out in a very long time that really put this issue, because her case is very much anchored in the environmental side of things, right? Why is it an issue as to how many children we have a right to have? Because of the environmental impacts. So it was kind of in some ways like unfortunate timing, where it's like, oh, if I had just been a few years earlier, right? Or something like that. But it also gave me an opportunity to build on what she had done, right? In some of my own work. So that's kind of the origin story. Eventually, I refined these ideas further and wound up getting a book contract for what eventually became The Environmental Impact of Overpopulation. The way I would describe it is that book is like a spiritual successor to the dissertation. They would not allow me to just reproduce my dissertation, because dissertations can now be accessed through any university library. So they wanted new stuff. They wanted new material, and also the audience is very different. The audience for the book is designed to be sort of a general interdisciplinary audience. The audience for your dissertation is literally the 4 people on your committee. Right. You just got to please those 4 people and get the pass. Right.
Amazing. Well, yeah, thank you for your insight into the process of all of that. Trevor, let me ask you, why are you or are you not an antinatalist?
Yeah, so I think I'm not even sure how some people would classify me, because I think it is sort of, it depends on how you define the term. So you mentioned earlier that Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy article. That article says something like anti-natalism is the view that procreation is usually or almost always wrong, or something like that. There's a stronger position than that, which is just procreation is always wrong. And I'm not sure exactly where I would fall on this spectrum of possible views, or exactly what the all things considered agreed upon definition of antinatalism is. If someone were to ask me if I was an antinatalist, I would probably say something like, well, under present circumstances, I'm kind of a conditional antinatalist. I think for the vast majority of people, they're not going to have great reasons to procreate, or at least at most to procreate once, right? To just have one child. But I would not say that I'm a thoroughgoing antinatalist, insofar as like I don't think it's the case that there are never situations where procreation is permissible, or that everyone should have 0 children, right? So, however, I'll leave it up to the viewers to figure out exactly how to classify that constellation of positions.
Yeah, no, absolutely fair enough. Well, as we'll get into in a little while, exactly how antinatalism should be defined and what an antinatalist is and what an antinatalist isn't is very hotly debated. And, antinatalism at this particular point in time has no standard definition. The only definition is the Wikipedia definition that keeps changing. It is not in a official word in any dictionary in the world. I've campaigned twice to have it added into the Oxford English Dictionary, and no luck. So we're at a very strange amorphous point, in exactly who all fits under that banner, what exactly it means. And so, I think exactly what you said. You sort of fall under a heading of a conditional antinatalist of some kind or another. Trevor, antinatalism often intersects with other social and ethical issues such as atheism, veganism, and the right to die. And you do briefly touch on a few of these subjects in your book. How do you feel that the subject of atheism, veganism, and the right to die intersect with overpopulation concerns, if at all?
Well, the most obvious overlap would be with veganism, I think, because there are a lot of people who have argued that in the long term, we've got to massively overhaul to support the population we're going to have. We have to massively overhaul the global food agricultural system to produce way more plant-based food, because the process of creating meat is extraordinarily inefficient, because you basically have to grow a bunch of crops to then feed to animals that you then keep alive for a while and then slaughter and then get the meat. It is much more efficient, just eat the crops, right? To just grow the crops and eat them yourselves. And there's also a lot of other things, other ways in which that process has lower fossil fuel emissions, and it also has you have a smaller amount of local waste because all those animal feces got to go somewhere, right? And that's not necessarily like, that's why areas around high density animal feeding operations don't tend to be places people want to live. So, there's a reason for that. So I think that if you're someone who is like concerned about the environment, and you're more likely than other people to think veganism is, something you'd support or something that you would hope more people adopt in the future. And so I can imagine people who are vegan being more likely to take population-related concerns seriously, because as I kind of alluded to earlier, we know that lots of people like to eat meat. The more people that you have who are meat eaters, the more meat you're going to have produced. And so if you're a vegan and you think it's wrong for various reasons to consume animal products, then it stands to reason, as things currently are, I could see someone like that being a conditional antinatalist. They would say, well, as things currently are with the food production norms, I want fewer people because I want fewer meat eaters in the world, right? Something like that. The other two, I'm less certain exactly what the explicit connections would be. How does antinatalism sync up with the right to life and atheism, like outside of the population sphere? Because you mentioned that it often comes up in those contexts. I'm curious.
Yeah, well, the atheism one is particularly interesting because I would say that the vast majority of modern antinatalism is extremely atheistic, but there is also a long, long history of antinatalism that can be found in various religions, particularly Christianity. Is a long history of Christian antinatalism, believe it or not. But, if there's no God, then what are we, there's no reason for us to keep producing. There's no reason, there's no grander scheme that, is demanding that we push forward. It's a DNA molecule that is just reproducing. That is, I think, I had one of my beloved ex-professor, Raja Halwani, was on the show at one point, and he put it in terms of, atheism, antinatalism, and a lot of these ideas are a way of sort of decentralizing the idea of the sanctity of humanity, basically. Like, if there's nothing divine about us, we don't have this divine origin, then it makes it easier to sort of conceptualize, well, we're just sort of here for no reason. There's all this suffering. So what is the point of creating all this need for no more need, for no need? And the right to die sort of fits into that too. If we're brought here for no really good purpose, there's all this suffering, then we should probably have the right to exit at the time of our choosing.
Yeah, okay. So you're saying the basic connection here is that the value of the sanctity of human life, if you are an atheist or if you believe in the right to die, you may think, well, sanctity of human life, not as sacred a value as one might be inclined to believe otherwise, therefore maybe not as important for us to keep procreating something.
Yeah, and also that if it's a recognition of suffering, that if it comes at this cost, if of the suffering, then why are we perpetuating it for no good reason?
Right. I guess I can. There are definitely some people who procreate because they believe they have a religious duty to do so.
Yes, of course.
So it stands to reason that if you're an atheist, you will not have those reasons to procreate.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Of course, I think that a lot of people procreate for what I would just describe as social reasons.
That's true too.
That has not really tied to religion specifically. Just it's what people do when they reach a certain age. Right. They settle down and they have a family. Something along those lines.
Yeah. Huge social pressures to procreate, for sure.
Yeah, so I agree that if you like, I can imagine if you are an atheist that does remove a set of religious, reasons to procreate. I do think there can be non-religious reasons to procreate, though. There was a book written recently by Samuel Scheffler called "Death and the Afterlife," but he does not when he says afterlife, he does not mean like theological afterlife. He means like the state of things after you are dead in the world we currently inhabit. And it's been a while since I've read this, so I'm at risk of oversimplifying this idea, but essentially he argues that the core commitments and things that give our lives meaning are almost all tied up with some kind of commitment to the ongoing continuation of human civilization beyond our deaths. A lot of our projects that we engage with as individuals and of which we are, part of collectively, don't really make any sense if, we knew, for example, that the human species was going to go extinct in 2040 or 2050 or whatever. A lot of those things would seem quite meaningless and a waste of time. And so I think that there's kind of a background question here of what would be lost if we went full throttle anti-natalism and catapulted toward human extinction. What values might be lost as a result of doing that? And then, as you say, some people would push back and say, well, one thing that would be lost is there would be a lot less suffering in the world in various ways. And that might be a trade-off that is more appealing to some than others, right?
I think what the hard anti-natalist is saying is that whatever we can gain in the future is too expensive, because the currency that it's paid for with is all of this suffering. And there's nothing that we can possibly achieve that is worth that. So that's sort of where a more extinctionist minded anti-natalist would sort of be coming from when contemplating the future. Yeah.
I can see how this is kind of a question about, I don't know, how we appraise, like how we quantify how much suffering there is relative to how much good in the world there is. I think those are very difficult value theoretic questions. Absolutely. I tend to be sort of agnostic about exactly what the net hedonic value of the world is, whether it's positive or negative, especially because there's, I mentioned earlier working with John Knowlton, he's a consequentialist thinker who takes incomparable values very seriously and has done a lot of his work since he recently retired on working out a logic of incomparable values, which I've seen some of it and it looks like a nightmare to me. But the basic takeaway I come from is there's going to be value comparisons that seem to be incomparable with one another, where you're not going to be able to put a greater than or a less than or an equal sign in the relationship. And that makes these kinds of calculations even more complicated and I think untenable. But this is also one of the reasons why I'm not necessarily a big fan of appraising the value of life or how we make moral decisions exclusively on consequentialist grounds.
Yeah, this is all very difficult. I just will say that from my perspective, I can't, one kid in a cancer ward, one wolf with its leg trapped in a trap, having to chew it off. Just one of those bad circumstances. I can't see anything that we can gain that would make any of that, perpetuating any of those circumstances, worth it. But that's just me.
Even just one?
Yeah. What could we, I don't understand what we could possibly do that would be, it's, have you ever heard the story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas?
Yes.
It's a story by Ursula K. Le Guin. And so it's this beautiful, paradise world. But, in a dungeon somewhere, there's this one little boy, suffering horrifically. I can't put the one kid in the dungeon and accept the paradise.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the same kind of situation. I mean, because that's a case where on my it's been a while since I've read it, but on my remembrance of the story, that kid sort of had to be there in order for that society to sustain itself. Like that was a necessary condition. But I mean, you mentioned like a person being in a cancer ward. There's nothing necessary about that. Like we may one day have medical technology to alleviate that illness, right? Like we did, for example, with smallpox. There was a time in human history where lots of people were suffering from smallpox, and over time, we eventually managed to more or less eradicate that ailment. So it's not a necessary condition of human progress that people be suffering from cancer. That's a contingent circumstance, right? That we're constantly trying to find ways to fix, right? So there's kind of a question here also about like how optimistic should we be about human progress moving forward. And this is another area where there's radical disagreement. I've talked to some people who think this is like the best time in human history to be alive, and because we actually have leisure time and we're not just constantly trying to survive, right, in a sort of state of nature. And there are other people who think like, no, it's still a really bad time to be alive. And actually, in terms of the raw numbers, there are more people suffering now than at any point, right, in human history, because human numbers are higher. So a lot of this is going to hinge on how optimistic or pessimistic one is about the current human condition and about our long-term trajectory.
That's certainly true. I guess I will just say that from my perspective, I think that we certainly will manage to cure certain things. We will certainly, I'm sure, alleviate certain horrors that befall humanity and animals. I'm sure that we'll solve problems. We're very good at that. We can solve problems. We're pretty smart as a species sometimes. But I just think that suffering is almost like a hydra. It's like you cut one head off. There's still a lot of heads that'll eat you alive. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. But let's I'm sure this is an excellent point of conversation. I hate to abandon it, but just in the interest of all the other stuff I want to ask you. So as somebody who knows far more than myself about the history and study of overpopulation, I am curious if you've ever encountered usage of the word antinatalism in its original non-philosophical context. Antinatalism was not associated with philosophy before 2006 with the publication of David Benatar's Better Never to Have Been, and one other work that same year called The Art of Guillotining Procreators, although it was in French. Before that, it did have rare usage to describe things like China's one-child policy, and unfortunately, also there was a number of historians that associated certain practices of like the Nazis, and they called that antinatalism. So, amongst other things, it does go back, as we think, as far as the 1950s. Nobody's really sure when the first usage of the term antinatalism was, but I'm just wondering if you've seen any evidence of that usage of the term within your research.
I think what you alluded to, like if we're trying to go back historically, is the association with it until pretty recently would be with eugenics-based policies. So the idea that they were anti-natalist in a pejorative sense, like an unjust sense, in that there were clearly groups being targeted that were not supposed to procreate. And sometimes these, the people who were being targeted were of a particular ethnicity or race. Sometimes they were of a particular socioeconomic class. But it was always those policies, the reason why they fell out of favor and historically looking back have looked so bad is because they were, aimed at particular groups of people. So they were not general anti-natalist policies. They were more like targeted, we want to prevent certain specific groups of people from being able to procreate, and we want certain other groups that are more desirable, or whatever, euphemism that we're going to use. We want those people to procreate more. But that's about the only, it did not, aside from, as you alluded to, like Benatar's work and criticisms of his work, and the occasional essay that intersects with that in some way, there's really not a lot of use of that term specifically in just like the general overpopulation discourse.
Okay, fascinating. Yeah, thank you for your window into that. I find that part of its history is really quite still uncharted. So I'm always interested in hearing, certainly from an expert about what they've encountered. So thank you. In addition to being a philosophical position, antinatalism over the last 10 years or so has also become a developing social movement as well. Since 2019, we began to see the emergence of things akin to traditional activism, like street outreach, meetups, even the formation of, let's call them proto-NGOs like Child Free India, Stop Having Kids, Anti-Natalism International, which is my collective, the AAPJ, which is the Association of Anti-Procreationism in Japan. They just changed their name to Anti-Natalism Japan, I think. Are you familiar with any of these developments? And either way, what are your thoughts on the advent of anti-natalist activism?
I've heard of a couple of those organizations. I was actually contacted by someone from Stop Having Kids.
Oh, nice.
At some point in 2021, and to be perfectly honest, the name was so striking. I had to sort of fact check, like, I got to make sure this is like a legit thing, because that's a bit on the nose. That's an interesting thing, because one of my worries about trying to campaign or champion population reduction via lowered fertility rates, one of my concerns is the pushback, right? So one of the things that we've found, that we've seen is like extremely motivating for people, is basically how much they despise the other side politically, right? And so my concern about, like I mentioned Sarah Connolly's book, One Child, Do We Have a Right to Have More? And her overall answer to that question, when you finally get to the end of the book, is probably not. And she seems to support a government policy, like would support a global one-child policy if it could be done, equitably, and under a certain set of circumstances. And what I worry about, for example, advocating a policy like that, besides the fact that historically those kinds of policies have often resulted in gender injustice and other kinds of like human rights violations or other things, putting that aside, just as a practical issue, I just worry that that's going to wind up being counterproductive in the long term, because you're going to have people who might be open to certain measures of like say increased access to contraception, or better educational opportunities for women, or improving sex education in high schools, or whatever, who, when they hear the one-child policy proposal, are like, oh, this is bullshit. They want to take away my freedoms. I'm not going to allow that, whatever. And now, where they might have been receptive to more modest measures, now they're just going to push back against you and reject it wholesale. And that's kind of what happened with the political situation with population in like the 1990s. Like, people basically sort of rejected it wholesale. And for like 20 years, we just sort of didn't talk about it, and population just kept ticking up while that was going on. And now that it's finally kind of back on the table, I'm sort of hesitant to do anything really extreme that might push people away. So it's interesting to me, like, this is kind of, to me, like an interesting social experiment, like this idea of anti-natalist activism, because anti-natalism is even more extreme than a one-child policy, right?
Oh yeah,
because it's a zero-child policy, right? That's the end goal. So my only concern, I do want to make clear here, I don't really have any bone to pick with anti-natalists or the people who are doing this activism, because I think that it's never going to be the case in my lifetime that we're going to actually see like any society drop to zero fertility.
Of course.
So, my view is, well, if it's successful, what's the effect going to be? Well, it's going to be fewer people having children, which means population reduction sooner rather than later, or population stabilization sooner rather than later. Those are goals I support. So I don't really have any, bone to pick with anti-natalist activism, in principle. It's just that I wonder if it will, succeed in making more people, sympathetic to that kind of view, or more reflective about whether or not they should have children, or if it will, if it got large scale enough, result in some pushback from opposing people or larger organizations or whatever. And that's an empirical question I don't really answer to, but it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Extremely salient points all around. Look, this is the stuff I worry about and think about all the time. I don't know. I'm positive that it will receive incredible pushback. And I brace myself for that all the time. I have to. And certainly we have seen some evidence of that. One of my guests recently was Verena Brunschweiger, who's somebody who's written a couple of books in Germany about antinatalism, and the pushback that she received was just incredible. Death threats and you name it. And that's just one example. Most antinatalists, yeah, they don't typically champion the one-child policy. So you're well aware of the pushback to that alone. What we're saying goes far beyond that, as you said, and that does get into some really gnarly territory sometimes. And so I don't know.
Yeah, some of it also depends on like whether or not you're pairing anti-natalist rhetoric with an actual enforcement mechanism.
Of course, yeah.
So, the big thing about the one-child policy is that is an enforcement mechanism, a way of trying for the government to basically tell you how many kids you can have and impose some kind of penalty on you if you don't comply. And so if you're presenting these ideas like anti-natalism, if it's being presented as, here are some reasons why we should be more reflective on how many children we have or whether we have children at all, that's very different than saying, being a little more heavy-handed and saying it would be better if we had government intervention to prevent as much as possible, prevent people from having kids, making it as inconvenient as possible for people to have kids. And there are also issues there about, rights of reproductive freedom and things like that will come into play. And that's another area where I could imagine very, very, very heavy pushback, right, against an anti-natalist position. The way I've tried to generally cash out some of these ideas when I've presented them to audiences is in terms of what I call procreative responsibility, right? So the idea being the question you should be asking is it procreatively responsible to have X number of children or to have a child under these circumstances, and then try to delineate how we make those decisions and what we do. It's it avoids, because the problem is there are certain kinds of buzzwords, right, that rhetorically you often just want to avoid when you talk about population concerns. Population control is the biggest one that I've found you just don't want to ever say, because some people will just tune you out. That's the point where your opposition will stop reading what you have to say or stop listening to you. I don't know if anti-natalism necessarily has the same connotation, because as you alluded to earlier, it's not a very widely known or used term. So that has some advantages because people may not have associations with it. So they may be more prone to listen to what you have to say after you introduce the concept.
Yes, 100%. And I think that all of the heavy-handed conversations, as you say, do exist. Certainly amongst anti-natalists, but in terms of the activism, I can't think of an example at this stage of the game that anybody's really taking it from a more political stance. It's more philosophical, and it's more tied to the child free movement as well. I would say is a big component of it as well, which is a form of anti-natalism, in my opinion anyway, but is less focused on things like extinction and all that. So there are ways, I think, of having a lighter toned conversation, even and people can go to the harder stuff if they want, the more top shelf anti-natalism. As I already mentioned a little bit in my intro, I think it deserves to be pointed out that from my admittedly limited knowledge of overpopulation activism and academia, it seems to be amazingly rare that anyone at all involved with the issue of overpopulation dares to openly speak about the subject of anti-natalism, regardless if they are for or against it. Am I correct in that assumption? Because the book that I apologize, I forgot the author's, I'm blanking on the author's name now, but the book that you mentioned a little bit ago, that preceded your
Sarah Conley's book.
Sarah Conley, yeah. She doesn't mention the word antinatalism as far as I'm aware. So again, I think you probably are the first. Do you know of anyone else? Am I correct in my thinking on this? And why do you think that might be?
I would have to. So there was one essay in an anthology about antinatalism. But I don't know the timing. It came out a little between me writing my dissertation and actually getting the book published, I think is when it came out, something like that. I would have to dig through my reference list though, which I don't want to do right this second. But there was one paper. So there's one essay in this anthology on antinatalism that I remember seeing that connected antinatalism to the environmental situation. That is the only example I can recall making the kind of connection that I made in my book. So that's the only. Now maybe there has been some stuff published in the last couple of years I've not seen where people have taken that up. my angle toward this from the beginning was I viewed the anti-natalist position as an objection to the kind of policy proposal I was putting forward, or the kind of, it's not just a policy position, but like basically the answer to what's the ideal fertility rate under the current circumstances. So some people would, some economists and other people say like, oh, well, the declining fertility rate is bad because less economic growth and so on. And that's one kind of objection. And there's procreative freedom concerns, right? Where people think like, well, there is no right number. People should just be able to have however many children they want. And then the anti-natalists have the 0 as the answer, right? The ideal number of children to have is 0, right? That's the ideal fertility rate. And so I viewed that position, the 0 position, as a distinct kind of objection. And so when I originally wrote my dissertation, it was just basically, lumped in as, here's a cluster of anti-natalist objections to this view that I'm carving out. And as far as I can tell, they're going to be those are the same objections that anybody who's putting forward like a population policy proposal that is greater than 0 but less than infinite, right, is going to wind up with the same combination of objections to their position that I did, right? The details might be a little different, but so I just kind of thought, if we're being intellectually honest, like however, rare a position may be, there may be good arguments for it. It should be taken seriously. So that's why, like, the anti-natalism chapter in my book is actually the longest chapter. I don't know if that's obvious, but it is the longest chapter by word.
Oh no, I noticed that. Yeah.
Yeah, and the reason why is because there are a lot of variations, different permutations of anti-natalist objections, and I think some of those arguments are worth taking seriously. It's not super easy to refute them. And I find that to actually be quite a contrast to the sort of reproductive liberty position, which is one of the shortest chapters in the book, because I just think it's quite obvious that people should not be allowed to have any number of children that they want under any circumstance. And it's hard for me to carve out an argument according to which that would actually work. I mean, all rights that we have can be curtailed under various circumstances, even things that seem inviolable, like the right to life. Well, yeah, you have the right to life, but if you were threatening someone else with lethal violence, they have a right of self-defense to kill you, right? Or at least that's a legally recognized, exception to your right to life. And yeah, you have a right to bodily autonomy, but if you start assaulting someone, we can restrain you, right? We can arrest you, right? We can do things like, so again, that's a basic fundamental right that can be restricted under certain circumstances. You got a right to free speech, but you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, right? And there are other kinds of, more modern restrictions on free speech as well. So the idea that your right to procreation would just be unlimited with no restrictions, no caveats whatsoever, is not consistent with how we typically understand rights. I just don't think. But the anti-natalist position, I think, is a lot more difficult to refute.
And I definitely do want to ask you more about your opinions on the specific anti-natalist arguments in a little bit, because I was really impressed by the number of them that you picked up on and that you responded to. Let's move on, to a proper, discussion of the subject of the book, the environmental impact of overpopulation, the ethics of procreation, released in 2021. I was wondering if you'd mind if I read the abstract really quick.
Nope, go ahead.
Okay, abstract. This book examines the link between overpopulation growth and environmental impact and explores the implications of this connection for the ethics of procreation. In light of climate change, species extinctions, and other looming environmental crises, Trevor Hedberg argues that we have a collective moral duty to halt population growth to prevent environmental harms and escalation. This book assesses a variety of policies that can help us meet this moral duty, confronts the conflict between protecting the welfare of future people and upholding procreative freedom, evaluates the ethical dimensions of individual procreative decisions, and sketches the implications of population growth for issues like abortion and immigration. It is not a book of tidy solutions. Hedberg highlights some scenarios where nothing we do will enable us to avoid treating some people unjustly. In some scenarios, the overall objective is to determine which of our available options will minimize the injustice that occurs. This book will be of great interest to those studying environmental ethics, environmental policy, climate change, sustainability, and population policy. So you spoke a little bit about this already, but how did this research originally come about, and what did the process of researching for this, look like? How did it become the book that it is today? And again, I know it started as your dissertation.
Yeah, so when I was working on it for my dissertation, there's very little literature that existed. The only real like book written primarily by philosophers that I recall using at that stage of development, so back in like 2015 to 2016. Conley's book came out in 2016 eventually, but at the beginning there was an anthology called Life on the Brink, which was edited by Eileen Christ and Phil Cafaro, and that had a lot of essays on population. It was written by a combination of philosophers and environmentalists, but all of the essays were about confronting the population problem and looking at potential solutions to it. So like the subtitle was something like "Environmentalists Confront Population" or something to that effect. And that was sort of my anchor, like kind of what I took as like, okay, here's the state of, you know, some existing positions. Obviously there were other things that I found along the way besides that, but I remember that book being sort of the starting point for doing a lot of the research and looking at what these folks had cited. The book came out in 2012, so reading it in 2015, it was still pretty recent. There's a lot more stuff that one can dig into now. I mean, there are some journals that since you know, I started working on this in 2015 have published entire special issues on just population. And I contributed to a volume of the Ecological Citizen in 2021 that did that. They had a special issue just on overpopulation. And fittingly, many of the people who contributed to Life on the Brink also contributed to that journal. So it's kind of like 10 years later, you know, an update in some sense on what things looked like. But I think that the main thing that I started noticing, you know, when I got towards the end of my dissertation is now suddenly this thing was on the radar. It wasn't just Conley's book. Like Travis Reeder, a little while after that, came out with a book called Toward a Small Family Ethic, which is basically, he characterized overpopulation as a public health issue in a certain way, and made a few arguments for why we should have. Now, Travis and I disagreed about, he didn't think you could specify in all situations like an actual number on what like the permissible number of children to have were. So his position was a little more, depending on your view, vague or context sensitive, right, than the overall kind of policy and position that I centered on. But we agreed on far more, I think, than we disagreed on. Once I was actually done with the dissertation and in a place to assess it, I wanted to, my first appointment after graduate school was a postdoc with a kind of environmental ethics sustainability focus at the University of South Florida. And I wanted to nail down a book contract quickly because it was obvious to me that there were going to be a lot more people writing about this stuff before too long. And you don't want to, in a sense, get scooped, right? You don't want to have somebody take your position before you can get it out there, right? So I was lucky enough to get a contract from Routledge and then work on it for a couple of years, update my so it wasn't just that there was new philosophical literature coming out, there was also empirical literature coming out. So we got some new somewhere in this whole process, we had like a new IPCC report, right, about the impacts of climate change. We had new United Nations population prospects for like the rest of the century. We had new reports like that come out. And you also had the occasional book or article that attempted to push back, right, against some of the, you know, sort of recurring concerns about population. So it's like we took 20 years off, but global population still went up during that time. Now that the problem is still here, right? That's kind of the wave that I was picking up on. And there were also some people who were like, yeah, we should still ignore it, which I'm not a big fan of those positions, but there are some. I think my favorite one that I've seen is there's a book called Empty Planet. And I forget the authors right offhand. That's the title of the book. And it's the most misleading title ever because the empty planet that the authors are talking about still has 9 billion people in 2100. And that's not an empty planet to me, and certainly not to any anti-natalist. But the basic thesis of the book is that the UN population projections are overestimates. It's an empirically oriented book. That's the main thesis. And so they think that what the UN has is their low fertility projection is actually what's going to happen. And that the approximately 11 billion estimate of 2100 is a major overestimate, and that we'll hit peak population. And it's the kind of thing where I'm reading it and I'm like, I really actually hope you all are right, because that would mean our situation is going to be a lot better than what, it looks like it might be. But the other factor here is, long term, I think we're going to need substantially fewer than 9 billion people. So even that would still, to me, be a significantly overpopulated world in 2100. But, I don't have any special insight into how the book was created, except, again, just trying to develop the ideas and the arguments and refine them from what I originally worked on and incorporate the new literature that was developing.
You do a brilliant job, I think, explaining why the subject of overpopulation has become so taboo. I don't think I'd ever come across a better explanation, honestly, as to why this subject has become so impossible to have. I mean, from what you're saying, it does seem like since the publication of the book, there is more open conversation of it now, which is great. I am aware of the dark history that population control practices unfortunately have, but regardless of all that, it's always confused me, why this subject is so off limits. That those, so for those out there that have not read the book yet, can you tell us a little bit about that? Just sort of like the history of how this subject became so impossible to have, even though it's so important, and how you say that basically it became sort of unspeakable since the 1990s essentially.
Yeah, I forget the exact year of the big political event was a United Nations conference in Cairo, Egypt. Right offhand, I want to say the year was 1994. I don't remember. I'd have to fact check that, but it was there. Leading up to that, there had been, so you got to remember, 1960s, there was a huge population scare, right? Because this was when we were at, percentage-wise, we were at peak population growth in the late 1960s, early 1970s, like over 2% annual increase in global population. And there was a big scare about that. Paul Ehrlich published The Population Bomb around that time, which was got a lot of people's attention. And in the wake of that, a lot of countries initiated what would be labeled population control policies, which later kind of was revealed to have not so great methods. So doing things like getting people who were illiterate to sign consent forms to voluntary sterilization doesn't look like a great practice, doesn't look just, looks like an obvious rights violation. And then but the bigger thing is, behind the scenes politically, there were clearly groups that were being targeted for these voluntary, quote unquote, sterilizations, and other people who weren't. And there were also issues with concerns about women's reproductive health and their reproductive freedom. So a lot of women in these countries are also living in conditions where they're already in various ways have their autonomy compromised. And so going into, and there's other stuff that contributed, but essentially going into this UN conference, people basically had kind of come to this view that, like, look, these attempts to resolve population concerns have been, like, the cure has been worse than the disease, in a sense, right? They've been worse than the problem that they were purported to solve. And there was a kind of decision made rhetorically about how to represent these ideas, and the ideas behind that were underpinning, like, sort of the impetus to reduce population were couched under the idea of reproductive health or something like that. And once they kind of made that rhetorical shift, phrases like population control or overpopulation fell out of political favor. They were generally viewed as things that you should not bring up, or things that they became, in some sense, politically taboo. There was other stuff that contributed to this in the background. There were areas of the world where religious groups gained significant political power and were able to do things like limit access to contraception, for example, or in some cases, reinforce pro-natalist values in various cultures. We talked earlier about how some people feel like they have a religious duty, to procreate, or to procreate a lot, right? What's the biblical phrase? Be fruitful and multiply, right? That sort of thing. That was part of it. I know at one time there was also some people, this is a really, like, cynical and twisted way to look at it, but I know that there was a sentiment at one time among some people in the developed world that the population crisis would resolve itself because of the AIDS crisis in Africa, right? So a lot of population growth was happening in Africa, and the idea is like, oh, well, that's going to solve the problem in some sense, which is wrong in two ways. One, it's just that's the morally wrong way to look at it. And the other way is we know that disease does not tend to, like, those tend to be transient events, right? Once those kinds of things pass, usually we stabilize back at the original base rate of population growth or stability or whatever we had. So it was just wrongheaded in multiple ways. I should acknowledge here that the stuff I say in my book about this, which is more in depth than what I've said here, is largely drawing on an essay from that Life in the Brink anthology by Martha Campbell. I forget the title of it, but she lays out many of the same points that I made. So that was, you know, I added a few things to it, but her essay was kind of, for me, was like where I got a lot of insight into what the history was about why, you know, it had become so inappropriate to talk about this stuff.
And I mean, and that'll do it. I mean, that's a terrible history. And so, you know, you know, hearing you say it all in one go, it does make a lot of sense, you know, kind of why we're where we're at with this subject. It's a lot of terrible things have happened. What do you say to critics of overpopulation who insist that we are in fact not overpopulated, but it's just that we're distributing resources poorly? That's what I always hear.
It depends in part on what resource you're talking about. Strictly speaking, as of this moment in time, we do produce enough food globally to feed everyone, barely. Some people think that by the time we're at, you know, in the early 2030s, that will no longer be the case. The problem is you're never going to have a situation where you have, you know, no food waste and optimal food security and a perfectly equitable distribution. And those people are living in a fantasy world. That will never happen. So that's one part of the problem. But if you're talking about other resources, some resources can't be distributed equitably. Think about fresh water. Fresh water, like aquifers and other things, this is not equally distributed around the world, right? So impacts associated with climate change, for example, that change global temperature and may affect the, you know, water levels in your local aquifers, or the size of your streams, or could affect the monsoon season and how much rainfall you get, for example. Those impacts are not going to be distributed equally around the world. There is no way you're going to have an equitable distribution of fresh water that's perfectly optimal. There are going to be some groups of people who simply do not have as good access to that resource as others. And there's not really a solution for that. Also, if we're interpreting like carbon sinks as one of the resources, climate change being a global phenomenon, the issue here is not that we are not distributing carbon sinks equitably. The issue is that we are depleting carbon sinks at a much faster rate than they naturally replenish, right? So that would just be a completely incorrect way to like diagnose that sort of thing. The other issue here, though, is that a lot of these people seem to have some kind of view that like the long-term goal for us on the earth should be, let's cram as many people as we possibly can into the habitable land mass. And, you know, whatever that does to the natural environment, to animals, you know, that's fine. Just get as many people in there as you can that the earth can sustain. But if the long-term goal is for everybody to live, say, comparably to maybe the lifestyle of, say, a European, so, you know, not as luxuriously or wastefully as an American, but to have access to a lot of the basic modern amenities that we care about and that we enjoy. A lot of recent estimates have suggested we might be able to do 3 billion people at that long-term, like long-term sustainably. We might be able to do 3 billion people, but that's about the upper bound. And there have been several different studies that have come, the exact number varies. I've seen as low as 1.5 billion, which strikes me as too low, but that's the low end I've seen. And I've seen as high as 3.5 billion. But somewhere in between 2 and 3 tends to be the most common place that researchers seem to settle on for like the long-term environmental sustainability with everybody. So all people, so not existing in our current situation in the world, we have massive inequality in people's access to resources, the amount of like their access to power and basic communications technologies and all this other stuff. If the goal is to live in a just society where everybody has roughly equal access to the resources that are kind of central to modern life, And again, probably looking at maybe an upper bound of around 3 billion people in the long term for sustainability. And if I can give you, like, after this gets over, if you want like to put in links to like studies that have, you know, investigated this question, I'd be happy to do that. There are quite a few that reach the same rough number, between 2 and 3 billion people. And at the time I was writing the book, I mentioned something about this. I remember bringing that number up, but that research has become more solidified since I've submitted the original manuscript to Routledge, which I think was at somewhere near the end of 2019. So there's also a background question here for people who think like, oh, we're not overpopulated, we just got to distribute resources better. There's a question about, well, what's the long-term goal for the planet? Is it a state where we're in a sort of sustainable harmony with the natural world, and we have 3 billion people living, you know, in a broadly just social situation with at least roughly equal access to the minimal resources needed to live a decent life in modern times? Or is it, oh, it's going to be a world with massive inequality in terms of like people's quality of life, maybe 1 billion people living well and 10 billion people not living so well. And we're just going to cram as many people as we can, you know, forget about wilderness, forget about, you know, wildlife, you know, we're going to let 40% of the species on the planet go extinct. You know, we're going to bleach all the coral reefs. You know, what's the goal? What is the long-term aim here with how many people you want on the planet and what you want the world that your, you know, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, et cetera, live in? Like, what's the goal? Of course, that wouldn't work for me because I'm probably not going to have any children, but, you know, but I'm still thinking about the long term. You know, I still want humanity to exist in a suitable state in 5-6 generations.
Right, but the attitude that a lot that I've seen, at least, I'm sorry to make a joke out of it, but you know, it's like, look, I can stretch my arms out. We can fit lots more people here, and it's just, yeah, it's like, what kind of hell is your long-termism gonna create? So yeah, thank you. Excellent points all around. You state that our total environmental impact equals impact per capita times population. But over the last 20 years, the overwhelming focus of those concerns with our environmental impact has been on that per capita part of the equation, and that the central focus has generally been on bad behaviors, consumption, and how we get people to, you know, gravitate away from those particular actions. Can you talk about what exactly one's impact per capita means and why you feel this has become so central to the environmental impact concerns at the exclusion of concerns about population?
Sure. So the equation that you just mentioned is designed to be a way to represent like the overall environmental impact of some given population. So it could be the global population, it could be the population of the United States, it could be the population of the city, you know, whatever it is. But for whatever that population group you're using is, take the number of people and you multiply it times the average environmental impact of that population, and that's going to give you the total environmental impact, right, for that group of people. So what we've generally focused on in talks about, especially about climate change, and to a lesser extent about just resource depletion more generally, in the last 25 or 30 years, the overwhelming focus has been on all of these high consumption, high energy, costly individual behaviors. And I think one of the reasons why this draws so much attention is because in some countries you have, like the United States being a paradigm case, one American has, you know, an ecological footprint 4 or 5, in some cases even like 6, 7, or 8 times higher than the ecological footprint of someone living in a developing nation. And that just looks problematic, right? If you just take that as a data point, and it is. And so a lot of people think, well, obviously the solution here is to curb back the environmentally destructive behavior. So if it's climate change, which is where this comes up the most, the obvious thing to do is you find ways to reduce carbon emissions. You transition to renewable energy, or you get people to do to fly, you know, take fewer transatlantic flights, or whatever the case may be, whatever the particular behavior is that you want people to engage in. But the idea is, it's not numbers that we should be changing, it's behavior. that we need to be changing, and particularly the behaviors of people who live in the wealthiest nations in the world, the US, Western Europe, Canada, Australia, and a few other high emitting countries. I want to be perfectly clear here that there's absolutely no doubt that that is a huge part of the long-term solution, right? So I remember being at a conference once and a person misrepresented my view as being like, we should focus on population at the exclusion of these things. That's totally not true. And I say this several times in the book in multiple chapters. We have to do both of these things in my view. So we've got to focus on doing what we can to change the per capita impact, the per capita environmental impact on a variety of different dimensions. But we also should be mindful of the human numbers equation. And one of the simplest reasons why I think we have to think about the numbers is that we've got pretty good evidence that progress on the behavioral reform front is not very good at all. In fact, the data we've got about global carbon emissions is going in the wrong direction. Now, I have not checked the most recent data because like the pandemic is kind of a weird blip where like airline travel was way down and people generally just going out and doing stuff, right, was way lower. So there was like a sort of dip in global carbon emissions for a while. And I haven't seen, kind of how it looked. But prior to that, like you go back to when I was preparing the book manuscript, every year leading up to that point, global fossil fuel emissions were going up. They weren't going down, they were going up. And even though we've got all this evidence, coming out like, oh, we got to half our, carbon emissions by 2030 and half them again by 2040 and so on and so forth, until we get very close to zero net emissions by 2050. The carbon roadmaps, if you ever look any of these up that have come out in the last 10 years, they're insane. They're never going to, there's no way that anything like that is going to happen. And it's because people like the modern luxuries, they're tied to the fossil fuel economy. People don't want to give those things up. If someone asked me, Trevor, you're really aware of all the problems associated with, the car you drive and the carbon emissions and so on, would you give up your car? I would say no. It's too important to how I live, especially in the United States, where we do not have great public transportation or a lot of alternatives. But in the population case, it's different. We got countries that have voluntarily, no policies in any way like coercing people. We got countries where fertility has gone well below replacement just because of creating social conditions that increase people's reproductive autonomy and give women more educational opportunities, ways to carve out, a career for themselves and to be independent. We know that we can create conditions where people will voluntarily lower their fertility rates. I don't know if we can create voluntary conditions where people will lower their environmental impact. Like it's not clear that we can, right? That seems like the case where more governmental intervention and coercion is going to be required. So to me, we should be trying to work on both of these ends of the problem, right? Try to lower fertility rates and also try to correct behaviors, but just recognizing like there is progress to be made. I would consider some of it low-hanging fruit, right? Progress to be made by in the population sphere that we should take seriously and we should go after. That's the main upshot of the book is like, hey, there's progress to be made on the population front. It can be done in morally permissible ways. We should do it, right? That's the idea.
100%. Trevor, your book proposes a plan of pursuing near-term population stabilization and long-term population reduction through what you call population reduction, the population reduction argument, PRA for short. Can you lay out this argument for us now?
Yeah, I'm going to simplify it a little bit because I think it's got it's like 11 statements in the book or something like that. And it progresses. Now that's 2 full chapters of content defending that argument. So I'm not going to lay out all of that here, but the starting point for the argument is I basically make the case that future people, meaning people who are not present, they don't presently exist, but they will exist in the future. Those people's interests should not count any less than the interest of a person who presently exists. So the fact that they will exist at a different point in time is, I think, no morally different than if they existed in a different place in space, right? So they're far away from us in time. Some people are far away from us in space, but all of these people, insofar as they're human and have the same basic interests, needs, etc., they should all be given equal moral weight. And if you take the interests of future people seriously, and you look at the empirical situation we're in, where we've got lots of short-term benefits that look like they're going to have really high long-term costs that are, I mean, we're already seeing some of those costs start to play out, but they're going to get worse over time, and they're going to be very long lasting. If you take that reality of our environmental situation seriously, if you're concerned about runaway climate change or widespread species extinction or massive freshwater and other resource shortages in certain regions around the world, if you take that situation seriously, then I think you got to come to the conclusion, we need to do something to reduce our total environmental impact. And there are two ways you can reduce your total environmental impact. You either do the behavior changing stuff that I alluded to earlier, in which a lot of people are focused on, or you just reduce the number of people engaging in the, problematic behaviors. And those are your two options. And of course, you can do both. They're not mutually exclusive, right? And I ultimately advocate doing both. And part of the reason I advocate doing both is, as I alluded to, it just looks like progress on the behavioral changing front, not very good. Progress on lowering fertility rates in some parts of the world, really good, even with minimal government intervention or advertisement or any of that stuff. And so the overall takeaway here is, given the gravity of the problem, we really need to do both of these things, because the problems are not that far into the future. We don't have a very large window to alter what things are going to look like in 2100. And this is especially true with population, because there's a sort of demographic lag. Even once fertility rates lower, initially, it takes a while, because of how procreation works, it takes a while for those effects to be felt at the population level, right? So even if we had a massive drop in global fertility right now, it wouldn't be until a generation down the line that we really started to see a big impact in terms of total numbers of people, because we would have to have a generation of people coming to procreative age and then not procreating while the previous generations, died reached the end of their life expectancy and so on. So that's, again, the basic upshot is we got to do both, but a lot of people have been neglecting the population side of the equation. So the upshot is supposed to be, we should do something about that too.
So the good news is you do believe that there is, we do have some good options, some good, some bad, some that maybe are somewhere in the middle. You break up those options under three categories: coercive methods, which restrict autonomy; not coercive methods, which enhance autonomy; and then there are some neutral zone approaches. Again, I know this does cover a large section of the book, but would you mind explaining a little bit about those three categories, what they entail?
Yeah. So when we talk, I'll start with the non-coercive strategies. So we know that if you increase people's access to contraception, other things equal, they on average have fewer children. Not hard to imagine why. It's easier for people to control, right, the number of children they have when they have access to contraception. And it should be noted that between 40 and 50% of all pregnancies worldwide are unintended pregnancies. Now, not all of those pregnancies result in birth, because some of those pregnancies are aborted, but it's pretty obvious that a lot of people don't really exercise full control, right, over their reproductive autonomy. Of course, there are some contexts where women's reproductive autonomy is just compromised by cultural and social circumstances. So it's not so much that, I'm not saying they're acting irresponsibly. It's just that in that case, they don't have the means, right? It's an issue of their circumstance that they're in, not like voluntary decisions they've made. But certainly in some contexts, it is a result of people it's not always just about access, but sometimes it's also about education. So one of the other things you can do to increase people's autonomy and non-coercive measures is just improve educational opportunities to learn about this stuff. In America, for example, we still put tons of funding into abstinence-only sex education, which is the wrong way to go. We have pretty compelling evidence that those programs just don't work. So they're not effective in reducing things like teen pregnancy, or increasing the age at which teens lose their virginity, or decreasing their rates of STI transmission. So they just don't work toward the aims that they're toward the aims they're supposed to accomplish. We know that comprehensive sex education does accomplish all those things, or at least that's what the data tells us. So one obvious change: put more money into those kinds of sex education programs, strip funding from these abstinence-only programs. Also, environmental education is one avenue you can go. So not just education about, but just making people more conscientious about the environmental impact of their procreative choices, right? So the most environmentally salient choice you'll make in your life is how many children you're going to have, because your children are most likely, with very high probability, going to adopt your lifestyle, because that's the environment they're going to be raised in for a very long time. And so, there are some details to work out, but by choosing to have a child, you're kind of creating, in some sense, a clone of your own ecological footprint, right? Now, it's possible that your country goes through some kind of green revolution during your kid's lifetime, and their environmental impact dramatically decreases because of that. But that's a hard thing to bet on, given what I've said earlier about the challenges and the slow progress on the behavioral changes that we need. So that's one thing. I'm trying to remember if there was anything else that I included under the heading of non-coercive. The two biggest ones are access to gender justice, promoting career opportunities and greater individual liberty for women, just more generally. Pursuing gender justice is another one that shows up a lot in the literature. I put to some extent less emphasis on this, because to me that's something that the reason to do that exists independently of population concerns. It's a additional benefit that promoting gender justice correlates with lower fertility, but there seems to be a substantial moral case for pursuing, gender justice, regardless of the ways in which it may contribute to lower fertility. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, the coercive methods, these are things I generally, either reject for moral reasons or practical reasons, but this is where like China's one-child policy would fall. Or any kind of government scheme that puts a strict limit on the number of children that you have, and that imposes penalties or potentially bestows benefits for compliance or imposes penalties for non-compliance. Now, there is a gray area here in between these two things where incentivization schemes might fall. So an incentivization scheme, like here's one thing you could do as an incentivization scheme. The US and the tax system is currently structured such that every child that you have as a dependent, you get a tax cut, right? You could invert that tax system to where you start with a number of exemptions that you get, or cuts you can make, and then every child you have, you lose one, right? Now, there's an obvious objection to that, which is like, yes, give the parents less money to support their kids, right? That's an obvious objection. But if you designed your social policy the way I just described, what you would do is you'd be creating a financial incentive for people to have fewer children, unless they had sufficient wealth, right, that they could support those children. Again, this is not an endorsement of that policy, just an illustration of how an incentivization scheme like this could work. So the incentivization schemes are kind of tough to categorize, because in some contexts, if the incentives are great enough, they might cross the threshold of being coercive, right? And especially like if you're someone who's socioeconomically disadvantaged and the penalty, for not following the incentive is high enough, right? That could seem to be coercive, to basically just mean, well, that's not really an option for me, and my hand is being forced here. So some people have tried to propose ways in which incentivization schemes might be designed so that they'd be like, for example, I've seen one proposal where you only bestow benefits of compliance with a policy to people who are below a certain income level, and you only impose penalties on people above a certain income level. So the idea is that, if you were, of a lower socioeconomic class and you had above the quota or whatever of number of children you were allowed, maybe that just means you're not eligible for some kind of government programs or benefits or something like that. But if you did that and you were, say, making a lot of money, now you owe an additional tax or something like that. So it's not just you're losing a benefit, but you're actually being in some sense penalized. I don't endorse any incentivization programs in the book, but I also don't write them off completely. I just think it would depend on the context and depend on how they're designed and also how effective they would actually be. One of the concerns about incentivization programs is that they may not really change people's behavior a whole lot. They'll just make people worse off. So they'll still be having the same number of kids, but they'll just be worse off in various ways than they were before. The one thing that I think is genuinely neutral and just which I would anchor fully in between these two things would be like advertising or what we might call media campaigns for educational purposes or whatever, government sponsored commercials or other kinds of ways of promoting a particular message, because this kind of stuff has been done in a lot of arenas before. Nobody really objects to commercials, for example, promoting brushing your teeth before meals, like aimed at little kids or things like that. So if you buy the idea that people being more reflective about their procreative choices is a worthwhile thing, like a good cause, then it would be unusual to object to like having a commercial, right, or other form of advertising promoting the idea. I do remember an example from Singapore that might be a little bit on the nose about that. Singapore once ran an ad campaign that was just a series of like posters or billboards, and I saw a couple images of a couple of them. One of them was parent on the left, parent on the right, and then a child in the middle, and they're all holding hands. And it just says below, the only text on the thing is one is enough. And that's all it says. And I don't know whether that advertising campaign was effective, but it feels a little bit on the nose.
Well, speaking of on the nose, Stop Having Kids actually recently got huge billboards like on the highway, telling people that. So I'll have to send you pictures of that. It's pretty great. But honestly, I am surprised we don't have more of that, done really, really well. Even now, I'm shocked that so little of that really exists. That's a funny example from that you bring up, though. Quoting from the preface of the book, one of the recurring themes of this book is that moral problems of a grand scale usually do not allow for tidy solutions. However, if we try to address these problems, there are almost always going to be winners and losers. Some will benefit, others will be harmed. It does seem sometimes like they're just simply there's no road ahead that is not going to cause some amount of suffering somewhere. And does this mean, in your opinion, that like ultimately the problem is unfixable, because there's always these like areas that we're never going to be able to go down, because obviously they're going to harm people? It just seems that no matter what, there's going to have to be some kind of hard, cold utilitarian math somewhere that needs to happen. Would you agree with that?
It depends on how. So I want to go back to your previous question. Like, are some of these problems unfixable or unsolvable?
Yeah.
It depends on how you understand the notion of solving a moral problem. This is one of the things that has bothered me for a while about some of the scientists who write about climate change and the way they conceptualize our approach to that problem. A lot of scientists seem to have this view that we're either going to do what we need to do to hold the global average temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius, or we won't. If we do it, then we succeeded in solving the problem. If we don't, then we screwed up and all hope is lost, or something like that, right? It's completely dichotomous, but that's not how climate change works. The way climate change works is a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase will be bad. It will have some significant negative effects that we will have to adjust to. 2 degrees will be worse. 2.5 degrees will be worse than that. 3 degrees will be significantly worse than that, and you can just keep ratcheting it up, right? Each temperature increase interval will be worse. The effects will be more pronounced: higher sea level rise, greater frequency of extreme weather events, greater disruption of the global climate system, greater number of climate-related species extinctions, et cetera, right? Just everything gets worse. But having what the world looks like in 2100, having 3 degrees Celsius average global temperature rise is still better than an outcome with 5, right? 5 degrees global temperature rise. So I think the proper approach to this kind of problem and most problems of this scale is not we need to solve these wholesale, because there are even very basic moral problems that we largely know what the right thing to do is, are usually never solved completely, right? So I mean, we've been in the United States, we've been battling problems associated with racial inequality for a very long time. And I'm not sure there will ever be a state of affairs where every conceivable instance of racial inequality is eliminated. But surely we have made progress, right? Surely the desegregation that resulted in the civil rights movement, right, was progress. Surely the abolition of slavery going back another century or so was progress. So the goal here should be to make progress and to be able to say, you know, we did better than certain other outcomes that could have transpired, right? That should be the goal. So, you know, is the problem, are these problems unfixable? No, they're not unfixable, but making progress is going to pose challenges. I do think that with population in particular, the choices we have now are not that bad. Like, I think there are still a lot of options available to us to like lower fertility in the next couple of generations in ways that would make a big difference without it being overly intrusive. But if you delay doing this, then we get to a point where, you know, 2040 or 2050, now our options don't look as good, because if we actually want to do something that makes a difference to population size by the end of the century, it's going to have to be a much more extreme measure, right, to enforce compliance. This is kind of the same thing that's playing out in the geoengineering debate, right? When that was originally put forward, people thought, oh, this is a terrible option. You know, again, one of these situations where the cure might be worse than the disease, right? By modifying the atmosphere, we're going to make things worse off than they were before. But now it's been a couple of decades of that debate, and people are looking at the progress or lack thereof on, you know, climate-related emissions reductions, and are thinking, yeah, you know, maybe a little bit of sulfate aerosol particles to increase cloud cover wouldn't be such a bad thing, you know, or you know, at least as a temporary measure while we switch over to renewable energy, right? So again, you know, how appealing certain options are and certain policies are is kind of contingent on what your situation is. And so a lot of the sort of the tragic circumstances I'm alluding to in kind of that portion of the preface that you read is that we may be put into positions in the future where our situation's not great and we have to choose between policies that right now don't seem very appealing at all or necessary, but they could be more appealing in the future. And so we got to start thinking about those possibilities. And we also have to entertain, you know, some hard choices about what we do. There's also just the practical reality that often the things we try to do in just and equitable ways don't always turn out that way. So I would not be surprised at all if there are some unforeseen effects of certain kinds of policies we might put into play that may result in some unintended gender inequity or something like that. I'm not exactly sure what those would be. That's why they're unforeseen effects, right? But there are things we'd have to be prepared for.
That makes perfect sense. I really want to make sure we get into, you know, a discussion of your chapter on antinatalism, which is from part 3, Objections from Alternative Approaches to Procreative Ethics, chapter on antinatalism, and it extends from page 109 to 130. And you cover, you know, a lot of great ground, you know, I think in this chapter. The chapter is really quite a good overview of different antinatalist arguments and why you either agree or disagree with them. I would like to start by just asking you, how did I mean, you talked a little bit about this already, I know, but I mean, how did the antinatalism come to be such a major part of the book?
Well, I mentioned earlier that I viewed antinatalism as an objection, you know, to my position. I had read, prior to doing any work on this subject, I had read Benatar's Better Never to Have Been, the 2006 book. And while I had not been convinced by the arguments in the book, I had thought it was interesting. And I had not anticipated that there would be so much uptake with that book at the time I read it. So by the time I was working on the dissertation, I went back, I saw, there were all kinds of criticisms that had been published of the arguments in the book. And also Benatar had been very busy responding to a lot of those criticisms of his work. And there was a new book out that he and David Wasserman had co-authored called Debating Procreation, which I think if I was going to suggest one book to read on the kind of current antinatalism debate, that might be it. Because it's, Wasserman is sort of defending I would describe it as a conservative pro-natalist view. It's very restricted. It is not the common sense, oh yeah, everybody can procreate all they want. Like that's definitely not his position. But Benatar is, of course, defending what I would describe an unconditional antinatalism. So the hardline antinatalism, like nobody procreates, nobody should procreate ever under the ideal, if things were in his ideal world, right? Procreation would genuinely be zero. So I just kind of got into surveying the different arguments and not like with any area of philosophy, I don't think that all arguments for antinatalism are created equal. I thought that some of them were not particularly strong and some of them were fairly strong and took a significant amount of time to respond to. But I guess the main reason why it became such a prominent part of the book, and I should mention that the dissertation chapter was actually much longer than what was in the book. I had to cut it down to some degree because it was too like I had a word range for what religion was after, and that chapter was taking up a little bit too much space. So I think there were 2,000 to 3,000 words of content that was either condensed or cut to make that chapter fit the requirement.
And that I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that version, that alternative version, it's accessible
it's in the dissertation. It's still there.
Apologize, I never realized that. Okay,
you could still find it, and I don't know. It's probably not as polished, right? So it may just be longer because it was a little bit less refined. But but the basic reason why I had so much to say about it is because I just think that some of the arguments are very tricky, and there's much more to say in favor of antinatalism than I think most people realize. I think it's an extraordinarily counterintuitive view, but there are lots of counterintuitive positions in philosophy that you can make good arguments for. So, if we're being intellectually honest, you got to take those positions seriously and try to say something about them.
People come at it from a lot of different angles. There's a lot of different types of arguments in favor of it. And I think you do a really good job of covering a wide variety of those. So you cover Benatar's axiological asymmetry, of course, and also the quality of life argument, the misanthropic arguments, Shauna Schifrin's consent argument, and you also cover Matti Hairi's risk, it's a pretty wide-reaching collection. I mean, would you mind at all going through sort of your views on each a little bit? I mean, like, why do you think that the asymmetry either succeeds or fails? What is your opinion of the consent argument, and what do you think about Matti Hairi's risk argument?
I'll try to keep this concise. Because that's a lot of terrain there it's
a lot. I know. I apologize.
To cover, and I'm not going to be able to recollect everything from the relevant chapter that I said. But for Benatar's asymmetry argument, I don't remember who made the response. I know I cited them in the book, but one of the basic ideas that there's an asymmetry between existence and non-existence, such that non-existence is always preferable to existence, because there's nothing bad that can happen to you with non-existence, but there is one good thing that comes with non-existence, which is the absence of pain. And when you exist, you can have good things and bad things, right? The existence of pleasure, but the bad thing is the presence of pain. Right. And so the idea is that non-existence always has like a one-up over existence, because you have a good thing and no bad things. The absence of pleasure is not a bad thing. Right. And there are I'm simplifying that a little bit, but that's the basic, that's the basic idea. And I thought that even if you accept that framework, there are lots of people, by the way, who just don't think that Benatar's right about it not being a loss, right, to not be able to experience pleasure. But I think that the criticism that convinced me that argument didn't work was the idea that even if you accepted that framework, the idea of, whether or not I would accept a trade-off of having a good thing and a bad thing over a neutral thing and a good thing depends on what the quantities of the relative things are, right? So I think the analog that I remember seeing in the literature was like a decision to maybe pay a significant amount of money to have a really, really lavish meal, like a really good appetizer, entree, and dessert, versus getting a mediocre sandwich for free. Where there are circumstances where you might well prefer to have the lavish meal, even though there is a bigger loss associated there in terms of you're losing money, whereas you're losing no money, right? In the other case, and getting a benefit, namely, like, it's not like the sandwich is like spoiled or something, right? It's still good. And I thought that was kind of accorded with my own impression of the argument, which is like, well, I'm not sure whether I would take that trade-off or not in the abstract. It depends on what the quantities of the items are. So I think, like, if I had to make a choice about my own existence, I probably want to know how good my life is going to be and what the ratio of pleasure to pain is going to be before I can make a decision on it. Now I'm going to group, I know these are not exactly the same argument, but the consent argument and the risk argument, I think that both of those in different ways are kind of, in a sense, too risk averse for how we generally live in the world. I mean, we often allow parents to make choices about the welfare of their children, even once they're born, right? And they can't give consent because they're just kids. They don't really know, it wouldn't be informed consent. They don't know what they're consenting to. And so I've never thought that, like, just, oh, well, you can't consent to being born, therefore it's always wrong to bring a person into existence. I can imagine situations where if you're subjecting your child to a very high risk, like they're at high risk for a genetic disorder or something, then that argument seems stronger to me in that context. But if you have good reason to believe that they would, live a fairly good life, or at least not be at high risk of any kind of serious problems, then I think there are at least circumstances where the parents could be reasonably confident the risk is low enough, right, that it's permissible for them to procreate. And that's kind of the same thing I think about the more explicitly risk-driven argument, which also I believe these are the same things that David Wasserman more or less says about these arguments in debating procreation. It's been a while since I read that book, but I remember, at least on these couple of arguments, I remember my own judgments kind of according with his to some degree. The quality of life argument is, I think this really goes back all the way to our very, very beginning of this conversation, where it's questions about what you think the human condition is like, right? So Benatar gives a lot of information about why our lives are not as good as we think they are, right? Where there are all these like small discomforts and pains that we often discount or don't really give their proper weight. But I'm not totally sold on that. I guess I would say I agree that we are evolutionarily disposed to look at our lives as being more rosy than they actually are, because it would just make sense, right? For our survival, for our species survival, it just makes sense that we would be disposed that way. But also, there just seems to me to be too much evidence from subjective experience of people that, some of the things that he mentions is like these little pains or inconveniences. I'm like, those aren't really that bad. And I also sort of think I don't evaluate how well my life goes just by a hedonic calculation of pleasure minus pain. And so I've been willing in the past to endure some significant suffering to complete like projects that are important to me. Anybody who's written a dissertation will tell you it ain't all roses and pasture and so on. It's a grind, and it's very challenging. But there's and I don't think that like on a hedonistic calculation, it's obvious that the pleasure I gained from doing it outweighs, the couple of years of work and toil and all of that. But it was a project that I wanted to complete. It was meaningful to me. It had what I would describe as like a non-hedonic value, right? And I think there are lots of things in life that people could cite that they think make their lives go well, or at least contribute to making their lives go well, that they can't be reduced to just a pleasure pain type of calculation. There was also the misanthropic argument that Benatar makes, which I think is actually the best argument he makes for why, because it's a basic observation. People do bad stuff. And this is the one that I remember wrestling with the most when I was working on this chapter, because I'm well aware of all of the facts that he recounts in his chapter of Debating Procreation, where he puts this book forward. Even the average human person, just a normal person, not a serial killer, not like a not a person who would describe as evil, just even an average person is going to engage in a lot of wrongdoing in their lives. Much of it may not even be intentional. It may just be a result of the social cultural circumstance they're in, right? And so there's a question here of like, are you really justified in bringing another person into existence knowing that context? And here again, I kind of think it depends on how we look at the long-term trajectory of humanity. I mentioned earlier a couple of examples of moral progress on the lines of like racial equality, and you can point to some on the lines of gender equality and other ways in which discrimination has been, we've been gradually eroding those kinds of immoral features of our society. And of course, I guess I'm reminded here of the Martin Luther King Jr. quote, the arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And so I think that I guess the way I would look at it is you should absolutely be wary of the ways in which your kids could wind up being unethical in various ways, and try to give them a sound moral education. But I also think that long term, we are getting better collectively. Humanity is doing better morally now than we were 300 years ago, say. And that given enough time, we'll eventually be creating people that are pretty good people, just as the default. Now, it may take a while. Now, of course, that's assuming we don't like wipe ourselves out in a nuclear war or something in the next 100 years. But if civilization progresses long enough, that I think we'll be better off, so to speak. But I also think in here there's a question about like how good is the average person. My suspicion is most people's intuitions would actually go kind of opposite of the way Benatar's go. Like I think a lot of people would probably think that the default, the average person, is like basically good, but just maybe prone to making mistakes in certain situations. I'll admit I'm not sure I have that same intuition about people. I sort of think that people are kind of just moral, like the default is that they're kind of morally neutral, right? Like everybody can be good, with maybe some exceptions for certain people who have certain psychological dispositions, like they can't feel certain moral emotions like empathy or something like that. But for the overwhelming majority of people, I think everybody can be good, but it does require a certain level of moral education. But I think it's at least conceivable there are some parents who might be able to provide an adequate level of moral education to their kids to steer them in a not maybe perfect, but a good direction. And we got to remember that anti-natalism on Benatar's view is the idea that no one can procreate under any circumstances, right? So all you need is like a small number, a small range of plausible cases where your children wouldn't necessarily turn out to just be horrible, right? Morally speaking.
Trevor, I really apologize. I mean, unfortunately, I don't have, we're sort of out of time today, but I wanted to make sure to let everybody know that this is a fabulous book. You've done incredible research, and it's definitely something that more people really need to go read. You can find it on Amazon. Trevor, how can people find you on the internet and help support your works?
Well, I've got a personal website, trevorhedberg.com, just spelled exactly like my name. Which hopefully by the time this airs will be updated to reflect my new, my recent appointment at the University of Arizona, and have a little bit of more recent news. But other than that, I do have an academic YouTube channel that a lot of what is on there right now is essentially stuff I was using during the COVID time for teaching. But I'm hoping to post some additional stuff on there, intermittently. in the future. Some of that stuff, could be of interest to people if they, I don't know, want to hear my thoughts on other things, right? Or see some of the lectures I've used in some of my remote classes in the past. Those are probably the two big ways. I do have web pages like on, the University of Arizona and such, but that stuff is mostly just going to be a repeat of what's on my personal website anyway.
Yeah, definitely go check out Trevor's YouTube channel. It's really an excellent channel. Not enough subscribers for sure. I'm really happy to hear that you'll be uploading more stuff. So once again, Trevor, thank you so much for being my guest today on the Exploring Anti-Natalism podcast. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. It was nice talking to you.
Please visit Trevor Hedberg at www.trevorhedberg.com. Purchase his book, The Environmental Impact of Overpopulation, The Ethics of Procreation, on Amazon, and subscribe to him on YouTube. Links below. Thank you for listening to the Exploring Anti-Natalism podcast. This has been Amanda Oldphan Sukenick. You can find me on the YouTube channel, Anti-Natal Wolf. Keep up with my daily anti-natalist news updates at Antinatal News on Twitter. Please follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. You can listen to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Buzzsprout, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Amazon.com, RSS feed, and so many other platforms. Email me at exploringantinatalism@gmail.com. The podcast's website, www.exploringantinatalism.com, was designed by the amazing Visions Noirs. Please follow him at www.bionoir.com and also follow him on Instagram. Logo art by the amazing LifeSucks. Subscribe to him on YouTube and check out his merch at www.etsy.com/shop/LifeSucksPublishing. Music by the wonderful I Doubt It. Subscribe to him on YouTube and check out our collaborative project along with our friend EFIL WV, The Right to No Longer Exist, which includes the podcast, The Right to No Longer Exist, A Right to Die podcast. All the best, and bye for now.